Yes. Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It gives me no joy, really, to be standing here speaking to this report. It gives me no joy because it's not something that I particularly wanted to get involved in, and it's not something that I think anyone who's looked at the issue will be comfortable with. But as a Member of Parliament who was on the Privileges Committee, I had no choice but to consider the evidence that was in front of us, and we had a duty to work our way through it. I'd like to thank Simon Power. I think that the process that the Chair of the Committee ran was fair, and we gave everyone a fair go. They had a fair go to put their point of view, and I think that it was a fair process, and I think that's what's essential to it. I think also what, from my point of view, was key to it was to approach the whole question with an open mind. I didn't have a view as to the guilt or innocence of any of the people involved when I entered the process, but my approach was that I had to look at the evidence and try to come to a conclusion. That's what we were required to do on that committee. And so when we looked at the evidence, what we discovered was that there was a case to answer. And as we went through the evidence, we discovered even more and more of a case to answer. In terms of the tests that we were to apply, there was a couple of different tests. One was a balance of probability. We had to decide on the balance of probabilities whether Mr. Peters had knowledge. Was one of the key questions all of us had to address. Which was at the beginning, I didn't have a view as to whether Mr. Peters had knowledge. I actually didn't know. But as time went past, there was more and more evidence around it. So there was the balance of probabilities test. Now, I don't think that this was a 51 to 49 test, because clearly this was an extremely serious issue, and you couldn't simply say 51%, therefore you can say that he had some knowledge. It had to be higher than that. It's hard to put a number on it, but it had to be higher than 51 to 49. The second test, of course, is the honest attempt test. The honest attempt test has been brought up here, and it's been claimed as a retrospective test. And I guess in some senses perhaps that's true, but I would ask you to cast your mind to what is actually being said, and I'd quote from the report. It says, "It is appropriate to expect members to make an honest attempt to return all of the pecuniary interest that they hold. In order to make such an honest attempt, members are obliged to turn their minds to the interests that they have. The onus is on the members to recognise and declare relevant interests." Now, it seems to me that this is the test that applied from the beginning. Who would argue that members should not have followed that kind of test, filling out pecuniary interests? It seems to me an honest attempt is exactly what was required. Surely that's what anyone is requiring of parliamentarians, is that they make an honest attempt. So to say somehow 3 years ago, or however long it was ago, parliamentarians weren't required to make an honest attempt, which seems to be the argument around retrospectivity, is, to my mind, puzzling. Are people really saying that a few years ago no one had to make an honest attempt? I just can't buy that, and I think the honest attempt test was a fine test to have. In terms of there were kind of two principles, I think, around this, in my mind. One was the public's right to know. The whole idea of pecuniary interests and what goes around it, and it's kind of paralleled with electoral law, is the public's right to know who's giving money to politicians and who's giving money to political parties. On the other side, we had the basic right of Mr. Peters to have a fair go. He had to have a fair go to present his side of the story to the committee. And so we had to try to basically meet both of those principles. But the public had a right to know that the pecuniary interest register was being applied properly, but we also had to give Mr. Peters a fair go, and I believe we actually went through that. In terms of the evidence, in my mind, it was difficult to try to put against some of the witnesses' words one against the other. We heard numerous stories. It was very difficult to know which was the right story when you were sitting there listening to them all. And so I think one of the key issues for me was around the December 14. December 14 was one of the key bits of evidence, because regardless of who rang who before December 14, something very important happened on that date. There were 2 phone calls and an email. And the first phone call from the billionaire to the politician, if we want to take the people's names out of it, the billionaire rings the politician, they talk about something. We don't know what they talked about, there's different stories. The politician rings the politician's lawyer, they talk about, this is immediately afterwards, they talk about something. And then the lawyer sends an email back to the billionaire and says, further to your conversation with the politician, here's my bank account details. This series of phone calls and the email were compelling evidence. They were strong evidence. The thing about them is that nobody denied this evidence. Nobody said, actually, this didn't happen. Those 3 pieces of evidence and the way that they're connected together are a central part of why I think the majority of the committee came to the conclusion that it did. There's a lot else that's around this, but we know that those 3 pieces of evidence were extremely strong, and nobody denied those 3 pieces of evidence. The question we got to at the end was around what to do about it. Once we came to the point of view that there was some knowledge of the donation, and I believe that there was some knowledge, and that it was a gift, the question was, what did we do about it? My view was that there were those who were calling for Mr Peters to be suspended from Parliament or all manner of things. I thought that went too far. I thought the report itself is sufficient penalty. It says basically that Mr Peters gave a false return. It says that he's in contempt, he's censured, and he's required to give an accurate return. I think these are quite severe penalties, and I think that it was a step too far and too much to suggest that there should be some kind of suspension of privilege or anything beyond that. So that, in my mind, was an appropriate response and an appropriate penalty to what we found out. Finally, I'd just like to say, I think this shows once again why transparency around money and political parties is so important. You know, the people out there, they want to know that the $50-odd billion of taxpayers' money that we're responsible for spending is not being spent in a way that's influenced by our campaign donations. That's what they want to know. That's what the whole transparency rules are about. We're responsible for $50+ billion of other people's money. How do they know that the way that we spend it is not being influenced by donations coming to us either personally or to our political parties? And that's why there needs to be transparency around this kind of stuff, to reassure people so that there's both the appearance and the reality that it's not influenced by those kind of donations. So it is a tremendously important process that we actually went through investigating what happened in this situation, but it is a much broader issue, and I think we need to make more progress more broadly on cleaning up the rules around it. Thank you.